From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Widespread protests break out in China against the government's zero COVID policy in the biggest demonstrations in years. How much of a threat does this pose to not only the zero COVID policy, but perhaps Communist Party rule? Plus, the Biden administration eases sanctions on Venezuela, including oil sales, in return for a promise to negotiate with the political opposition. Is the trade worth it for American interests and the people of Venezuela? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal Opinion Pages, and I'm here today with Joe Sternberg and Mary O'Grady. Welcome to you both. Protests are not uncommon in China, but they're usually related to some local outrage, a commercial difficulty, or a real estate confiscation, or some government abuse. And usually the demonstration is an attempt to get the attention of Beijing to intervene. This is unusual because it's a revolt against a nationwide policy, the zero COVID. Around the country, we saw social media videos made by Chinese citizens, and notably in China, in Shanghai. The phrase Xi Jinping stepped down, referring to the president of China and the general secretary of the Communist Party, who was just reanointed for another term, a third term. And that's a very dangerous thing to say in China. You can end up in prison for years or simply disappear for saying things like that. The trigger seems to have been a fire in Xinjiang province that killed 10, in part because of COVID lockdown policies. Xinjiang has been locked down, the most recent episode of lockdown since August. The protest seems to have caught authorities by surprise, and as we speak here, police are now taking harder action to prevent demonstrations and people from meeting. And of course, behind the scenes, arrests are no doubt taking place. Joe, what do you make of this, and how significant is it?
I think this is a very significant event. Do I think that the collapse of Xi Jinping's administration or the Communist Party regime is imminent? Probably not, because I fear that we are going to discover in the coming days that the authorities still will have the wherewithal in terms of the policing, in terms of the online censorship and control of the internet within China to eventually suppress these protests. But I think that the fact that this is happening at all is really significant for some of the reasons that you mentioned, Paul. I mean, for example, the tenor of this is very different. I mean, when I lived in Hong Kong, where you're writing for the Journal from 2006 to 2014, I mean, you often heard people say there's a protest somewhere in China every day. It was important to remember because we tended to think of communist China as some sort of Stalinist totalitarian regime, and that wasn't entirely accurate in terms of how the Chinese Communist Party would maintain control over the country. And in fact, what would often happen is you would have this phenomenon of a local group of workers at a factory, or people who were angry at the local bank for having collapsed or upset at the local government. You know, people might protest in response to those very localized issues, hoping that, Beijing or the provincial government or some higher figure would intervene on their behalf. And so, as you pointed out, Paul, I mean, first off, it's very important to note that these protests are directed at Xi Jinping and the central government, and they are very unhappy with concrete policies that the central government is imposing in terms of zero COVID and all of the lockdowns. So I think that's one important thing. And then the other important thing is that it does seem to be national, that these have managed to pop up in cities around the country despite very aggressive censorship of the Chinese internet and the speed with which the authorities will take down social media posts that are at all politically threatening. The word has still gotten out. And so that suggests that something is going on there in terms of general frustration with zero COVID and potentially with other things going on in China right now that the authorities do not have as much of a handle on as we probably thought they did a week ago.
You mentioned zero COVID being the root of this. Let's listen to Anthony Fauci, the American doctor who is one of the architects of America's COVID response, talking about the Chinese lockdowns for COVID.
It seems that in China, it was just a very, very strict, extraordinary lockdown where you lock people in the house, but without any seemingly end game to it. If the end game was to, let's get everybody vaccinated, including and particularly the vulnerable, then you could see how a temporary lockdown like that, but they went into a prolonged lockdown without any seeming purpose or end game to it, which is really doesn't make public health sense.
Well, I'll note the irony of Anthony Fauci, who once said 15 days to slow the spread for a lockdown that became almost 2 years in the United States, obviously with the U.S. federal system varying by state and severity. Never as severe, or at least after the first couple of months, not as severe as China. But he's right that China has had draconian lockdowns. Shanghai had another lockdown in April. Everything locked down for 2 months, and people reported having trouble getting food. They couldn't even go out of their house. They had to be monitored if they walked their dog. And the root of the concern here, I think, in China is that after 2 years of lockdowns, we've learned that they don't stop the spread of COVID. They merely delay it. And China has not, because of its lockdowns, had the spread of natural immunity that has taken place in the United States through having people broadly infected. They also have a subpar vaccine, the domestic vaccine. They have not imported the U.S. Pfizer or Moderna vaccines based on the mRNA platform for, I think, nationalist reasons. And so a lot of the elderly population is especially vulnerable. But one study at Fudan University said that if China completely opened, there could be up to 1.6 million people who die. So, Mary, this is a dilemma for the government on whether or not they would accommodate the dissenters and open up some or all, but at the risk of significant illness.
It's hard to think of a country in the world that avoided, some death toll from the COVID. And the question became over these last 2 years, 2.5 years now, whether you are going to do it the way China's doing it, where you killed the economy and eventually paid the price on the COVID side, or you allowed sort of a careful, something like Sweden did, where they allowed people to continue their daily activities. They had COVID deaths, but they didn't kill their economy. And I think, sadly, China is proving that there's no way to avoid this sort of plague, this pandemic. And, the question comes down to whether you choose the right policies to basically minimize the overall harm. And I think it's pretty clear they went the wrong way.
Not nearly enough hospital beds and intensive care beds for broad-scale illness in China. Guangzhou, southern province, announced the other day it's opening facilities with 250,000 spots for quarantine or hospital-like care. We don't know how good that care will be. So they really are unprepared here, even after nearly 3 years of this virus, for opening. And Joe poses a dilemma for the economy. They've had to make the lockdowns have reduced growth in China. I think they had a target this year, about 5.5% of GDP growth is going to be under 3%. And that's if you believe the official figures. Who knows, could be worse than that. And again, if the lockdowns continue, which in the last day or so, the country has said they will, and showing no bending, you're going to see another slow growth year next year.
Yeah, I think that the economic implications of this, both for China itself and the Chinese people and for the rest of the world, are pretty substantial because China, of course, is now the world's second largest economy. So I think that our experience globally over the past couple of years has been what happens in China in terms of zero COVID policies and roving lockdowns and the like matters a great deal to everyone else outside of China. And they're trapped in this position now where anything that they do at this point is going to exacerbate the kind of societal problems that are contributing to these protests now in the first place. So I think that the root of this has been a combination of the political lack of an off-ramp. In a non-democratic system with a very authoritarian approach to policing lockdowns, they never came up with the mechanism that we had in the West for people to say, we've reached a point where we understand what lockdowns are like, and we also understand that there are risks to the virus, and we just are going to have to learn to live with some of the COVID risk. Chinese society has never had an opportunity to do that. There's no mechanism democratically or even just through civil disobedience by not wearing masks for people to say that they disagree with the government's zero COVID approach, and that is contributing to the frustration that you see in the protests. You have a social trust problem there that I think that we don't really understand, which seems to be contributing to these low vaccination rates and why people don't seem to be willing to actually get the vaccines that are on offer there. And, I think that that feeds into and arises from a lot of the social problems that are created by living under that kind of regime for such a long time. And, the very deep but subtle effects that that can have on your society. And that'll only get worse if they now have a health disaster emerging after the misery of the nearly 3 years of the lockdowns. But we also see in the protests that they can't necessarily keep going with the lockdown.